American universities have become the biggest scam of 21st century. Instead of churning out educated members of society, they are churning out cold, hard cash, a money-making machine, not for the benefit of students or society, but for the administrators, politicians, debtors, and the board members. Universities have become hedge funds, billion-dollar hedge funds, which benefit the elite of this country while students get shackled in more and more debt. Up to 1965, nobody took out loans to go to universities, but then the government started guaranteeing the student loans, which meant that if students didn't pay loan back to the bank, the government will give the bank the money owed, which meant that student loans basically became free money for the banks, and the banks started giving loans to the students. American universities became more accessible to students. This is where the biggest scam of American history started. At the top of this scam is Harvard. Harvard has a hedge fund of $51 billion. That puts Harvard as the 82nd largest economy in the world. Harvard is bigger than 100 economies of the world. They're even bigger than the economies of Libya, Lebanon, and Tanzania. With that big of a hedge fund, Harvard can pay its $55,000 tuition for every single one of its students for the next 500 years. But does any of this hedge fund money ever reach the students? The answer is no. Every single year, Harvard increases its tuition fee. They even cut costs by moving classes online during pandemic. But Harvard isn't alone. Yale has a hedge fund of $42 billion. Stanford has got $38 billion, while Princeton has $37 billion in its hedge fund. But as the university administrator, you would never call a hedge fund a hedge fund. The word hedge fund has a negative feel to it, so they gave it a name, endowments. Endowments, which on paper are meant to support students, teachers, and research projects. But the reality is, these endowments are used for something else. For example, this money goes into the pockets of the university's administration. Harvard paid their endowment chief $6.2 million in 2020. Harvard former president Drew G. Faust made $3 million in 2018. President of University of Louisville, James Ramsey, received $4.2 million in 2018, and Vanderbilt University's Chancellor, Nicholas Zappos, received nearly $3 million bonus after he made budget cuts and layoffs. From 1980 to today, university tuition has increased by 1,200%, while the inflation, it's up only 245%. That extra 1,000% had to go somewhere, and it didn't go to students or research. So while you're doing jobs and pay off your students' loans, the pockets of academic elite are getting heavier and heavier. But if you thought that was it for this racket, you're mistaken. Let's take an example of Florida International University. They have over 60,000 students and an average tuition fee of $18,000 a student. 60,000 students and $18,000 each equals to around $1.1 billion in just tuition, which puts these billion-dollar universities like Florida International on the same level as companies on the Global 2000 list. But universities like Florida International have one major advantage over these billion-dollar companies. It's that all those billions are tax-free. No tax on universities' real estate, tuition sponsorships, and more. So there's a complete tax exemption on every dollar these universities make. And things just don't stop there. According to universities like Florida International, tuition only makes just a small portion of their revenue, 30%. Universities get 20% of their revenue from the state, which comes directly from the taxpayer's pocket. So high tuitions, tax exemptions, tax subsidies are not enough to educate the youth. So now universities have turned to foreign donations too, which amounted to $12 billion in 2022 alone. And the countries which are donating the most money to American schools are countries with terrible human rights records. Since 2012, Qatar donated $2.9 billion to American universities, China $1.2 billion, and Saudi Arabia $1.1 billion. So now that the universities have billions of tax-free dollars pouring in, they just can't let it sit there. So what should be done with all of this money? Maybe reduce the tuition? No. What they actually do is they hoard all this cash and start a hedge fund. All this money is invested into commodities, real estate, and private equity. Today, university endowments have amassed over $500 billion worldwide, and all that wealth is concentrated in a small group of academic elites and politicians. 11% of universities in the US hold 74% of all the endowment money in the world. 1/3 of all American students have student loans above $100,000. Universities are totally dependent on $1.6 trillion of growing student loans. Without student loans, their entire business model would fall flat on its feet. So why is the university racket possibly history's biggest scam? It has no real competition after all, because most scams like Ponzi schemes don't last very long. Because when you're taking more than giving in a relatively free society, the public eventually turns on. But the university scam has been going on for decades. The general public has been getting fooled for too long. Even though students know they're being ripped off with high tuitions, even though they have no idea what they want to do with these degrees, they still pay thousands of dollars to these universities. But things are slowly changing now. Universities are dying slowly. Youth have started realizing that paying thousands of dollars and getting trapped in student loans to get a degree is not worth it. Almost all kinds of education can be obtained from the internet. And with tools like ChatGPT, students can learn almost anything for free. So what do you think about the current situation of our education system? Tell us in the comments below.